Thank you. It's wonderful to be here in Amsterdam. This city and its leaders have been pioneers of HIV treatment and prevention, reaching out directly to groups who have faced discrimination in other countries and seeking out bold solutions. As early as 1984, Amsterdam became the first city in the world to implement a needle and syringe program. One of the most effective and still underutilized ways to reduce the spread of HIV. And this city's leaders have continued to fight for marginalized populations, migrants and refugees, sex workers, people who inject drugs, women and girls, and the LGBTQ community. It's no surprise given the values Dutch people are known for. Values like inclusion, multiculturalism, and freedom of expression. You can feel it in the air here. Amsterdam is a beacon of openness and acceptance in a world that more and more feels consumed by isolationism and judgment. So I can't imagine a more fitting place for us to gather to continue this fight. And yet, as I stand here in this beautiful city, in this proud country, I have to acknowledge another piece of Dutch history, one that's very personal to me. Along with being an actor, an activist, and a mother, I am also an Afrikaner. Ja, ek is 'n Afrikaner en is lekker om met taal te praat wat in 'n land waar van julle my kan verstaan, 'n bietjie, nee. Ek hoop so. Okay. My family are descendants of Dutch people who settled in South Africa during the colonial period, and like most colonial powers at the time, many Dutch who arrived on South African shores nearly 400 years ago held a worldview that was deeply, unequivocally wrong. They believed the lie of white supremacy. They didn't see local people they met as their equals. They didn't even recognize them as full human beings. They saw them as a resource to exploit or a problem to eradicate. And they organized their society around those prejudices. Some 400 years later, South Africa is still struggling to fully dismantle those racist systems founded on those beliefs. So, what does this have to do with the modern AIDS epidemic? The hallmarks of colonialism, dehumanization, and discrimination and stereotypes and stigma are also the hallmarks of the HIV epidemic. These attitudes have fueled the spread of HIV from the start and continue to cover abuse, neglect, and injustice. It's not all bad news. We have come a long way as a global community from that moral panic that defined the early stages of this epidemic. Most of us now know and understand that HIV is not just about sex or sexuality. It is not, as the American Reverend Jerry Falway once suggested, God's punishment on promiscuity. We know it is linked to the second-class status of women and girls worldwide. We know it preys on people who lack the resources or the ability to protect themselves, like young people and young girls in particular. We know it targets communities that our society has exploited, has shamed, has discarded. Communities like sex workers, people who inject drugs, and our trans community, and men who have sex with men. And we all understand this. So what are we doing about it? As hearts and minds have changed, have our organizations and approaches followed? I would argue they haven't. I mean, how many of us have taken steps to challenge our own stereotypes and confront unconscious bias in our own search for effective solutions? How many of us can truly say that our strategies are driven by the most affected and developed from the grassroots up rather than from the top down? How many of us are investing our time and resources and engaging our greatest allies and our most valuable resources, the young people and the local leaders who are essential to stopping the spread of HIV in their communities? And I understand that my comments might not sit well with everybody here today. Me being a privileged descendant of European colonizers, a white South African, standing up here calling for us to be more inclusive. But those of us who have been beneficiaries of unjust systems cannot change where we come from, nor can we change the past. But what we can do is use our positions and platforms to create environments and opportunities where others can succeed. Last week I was in South Africa with my Africa Outreach project, where we visited some of our incredible program partners. We were in the Eastern Cape, an area that's incredibly rural, and we met some amazing young activists who were leading dialogues with community elders and religious leaders and parents around topics like gender, like transgender and LGBTQ rights, access to youth-friendly sexual and reproductive health services, and the inexcusable high rate of gender-based violence and rape. And I couldn't stop thinking, if these youth who have so few resources and have so many dangerous beliefs working against them can talk about the toughest social issues with such courage and conviction, what is our excuse not to do the same? Why can't we all be that brave? I am so inspired by these young people. And today I am humbly acting as their messenger, sharing their passion and amplifying their voices. But really, they are the leaders that should be up here on this stage speaking. So, as we gather in this enlightened city, in the 37th year of the AIDS epidemic, as we confront a rising tide of nationalism, nativism, and dehumanizing rhetoric all around the world, I hope we are inspired by our hosts here in Amsterdam. I hope we use our positions, our privilege, and our influence to fight injustice. I hope we learn from the lessons of our history and use them to change the course of our future. Because this movement that we're all called to be a part of is even bigger than the 30-plus-year fight to end AIDS. It is inextricably linked to the centuries-long fight for equality, dignity, and human rights. And the only way to win this fight is by shifting power, by investing directly in the people who've been shut out, oppressed, and pushed out to the margins, by elevating local voices, supporting community leadership, especially our young people, by spreading opportunity, access, and the tools to live healthy lives, not through one-size-fits-all solutions, but engaging one person and one community at a time, by always keeping the human element of the heart and at the heart of all of our work. Because numbers and outcomes are very important, but not as important as treating people as people. I began today talking about my ancestry. I began talking about my ancestry today, but I'm really here because of what I've witnessed during my own lifetime. I saw my home, South Africa, brought to its knees by the AIDS epidemic. I grew up during apartheid. I watched my country tear itself apart with prejudice, and then I watched it transform itself with Ubuntu. Ubuntu, the recognition of our common humanity, the belief that we are all bound to one another, all of us. It's a powerful force, more powerful than anything that can divide us. And I feel it in this room. I feel it here in Amsterdam. I'm so grateful to be here together with all of you, still fighting. Thank you for your dedication and for your extraordinary life-saving work. Thank you.
To give a short welcome address and to introduce our first plenary speaker, please welcome to the stage the Right Honourable Alistair Burt MP, Minister of State for International Development and Minister of State for the Middle East at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Alistair Burt was appointed Minister of State for the Middle East at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Minister of State at the Department for International Development on 13th of June 2017. He entered Parliament for the first time in 1983 and was elected Conservative MP for the North East Bedfordshire in 2001.
Good morning. It's an honour to be here in Amsterdam at the 22nd International AIDS Society Conference, representing the UK government and co-chairing this important plenary. I'm sure we'd all like to thank Charlize for her opening address. She made reference to the importance of recognising the vulnerable, the situation of women, second-class citizens around the world for way too long. She challenged us with questions about stereotypes, and then at the end she brought it all together with her own background and understanding of how prejudice can be overcome by that common sense of humanity. Charlize, we owe you a debt for your opening address. Thank you very much. We'll be hearing from many more speakers in this plenary and over the coming days, working through one of the greatest challenges the world faces. How do we prevent HIV infection and end AIDS? Indeed, we're all here to listen to each other's voices and perspectives. We represent civil society, activists, young people, academics, governments, the private sector. And it's essential that we find moments like this to come together, to learn from each other. And we must also use these opportunities to challenge each other. As a politician, I know that debates can be difficult, but they are healthy, and we cannot solve complex problems like HIV and AIDS without debate. This conference must focus on finding collective solutions. Quite frankly, we cannot claim that the end of AIDS is yet in sight. We've made great progress as an international community, but we're not driving down HIV infections fast enough, and people are still unnecessarily dying from AIDS at an alarming rate. This is especially scandalously true for young women in Africa. We actually have many of the solutions at our fingertips already. They're just not being used. Funding is, of course, essential to tackling HIV. I'm proud to say that the United Kingdom is playing our part. We're the second biggest global funder to HIV prevention, treatment and care, investing £2.26 billion between 2007 and 2017. And our multilateral partners, particularly the Global Fund and UNAIDS, are playing a vital role alongside national governments who are showing leadership in addressing their HIV epidemics. But a lack of political will and respect for the rights of women and the most marginalised in society sadly remains the biggest barrier to ending AIDS in too many places. So let me urgently call on fellow world leaders to protect the most vulnerable in their societies. We cannot leave anyone behind, because it's our moral duty, and also because we cannot end AIDS unless we do so. I'd like to use this opportunity briefly to set out the UK's priorities for the international HIV response. The UK will continue to follow the evidence of what works in tackling the epidemic in any given context. We'll continue to work to ensure our assistance, including through the Global Fund, gets to those countries least able to fund the response themselves, and that within those countries it reaches the people most left behind, particularly key populations and women and girls. In places where we don't provide aid, we'll use all the tools at our disposal to press for approaches rooted in public health evidence and human rights. And let me reiterate the point about human rights. The UK government believes that human rights are universal and should apply to all people. I urge the international community to address discrimination, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and to celebrate diversity and tolerance. Through the Global Britain Fund, we're supporting LGBT activists to demand their rights around the world, and we're proud to have been a funding donor to the Robert Carr Civil Society Networks Fund. So I'm delighted to announce here that the UK government is increasing its support to the Robert Carr Fund from £9 million to £15 million up to 2021. We hope this encourages more donors to come on board and increase their contributions to the fund. Civil society, with its links to communities and people living with HIV, has a central role to play in championing the rights of most at-risk populations and those living with HIV, providing care and support services to communities that others cannot, in holding governments to account and leading a social movement for prevention. Indeed, HIV prevention must get more attention. We're doing a brilliant job of expanding access to treatment, and this must continue. But the data is telling us we're not preventing enough new infections. We need to renew our focus on primary prevention and consider the inequalities in our societies. Addressing the structural drivers of HIV infection is essential. We know that adolescent girls are worst affected. They're unable to secure their sexual and reproductive health and rights and protect themselves from HIV infection. The evidence is telling us that this is driven by harmful gender norms, violence against women and girls, as well as poor education and limited economic opportunity. In other words, the failure is political. A failure to see key populations, people who use drugs, LGBT people, sex workers, prisoners, as people, denying them the rights-based services that we know save lives. It's certainly challenging to shift the structures and social norms that lead to a person becoming infected with HIV and other diseases, but we must persevere and continue to make our investments smartly. By working across sectors, by integrating HIV with TB services, by linking HIV to sexual and reproductive health and rights, embedding it in education and within broader health systems, we can tackle the drivers of HIV infection through all our funding. And we're looking forward to our first ever high-level meeting on TB at the UN General Assembly in September, where we're pushing for an ambitious outcome, including on TB and HIV infection. The UK is prioritising HIV integration, from health systems strengthening to girls' education, through our development and humanitarian programmes, and we will continue to drive a multi-sector approach to preventing and treating HIV. And we will continue to put women and girls at the heart of everything we do. Gender inequality is an injustice that continues to negatively impact all of us everywhere. The UK will also continue its significant support to technological innovations and market shaping. I'm proud that our 20-year agreement with UnitAid and ongoing support to the Clinton Health Access Initiative has given the world great advancements in testing and access to better treatments at affordable costs. And I'm proud to say that the UK is providing financial backup through a new venture, MedAccess, to support the Hologic Global Access Initiative, a transparently priced viral load testing package that will be launched here tomorrow to achieve up to a 40% reduction on existing 2018 prices for eligible countries. You will see much more UK aid-supported research, evidence and technological innovations today and over the course of the conference. These advancements are all achieved by working in partnership. None of us can go it alone. We have finite resources and a complex problem to solve, and that is why the UK prioritises working with and through our partners in joint initiatives that allow us to break silos and maximise comparative advantages. Indeed, that's why we're here today. By working together, we can make the difference needed to turn the tide on HIV infections. Too many people think that HIV is yesterday's epidemic. It's not. We know that to lose focus now would be to risk all that we've achieved. So we need to keep talking about HIV. We need to keep making our case to people outside these conference walls. We need to keep investing in the response, and we need to hold fast to the tried and tested public health and human rights-based interventions that we all know work. So, speaking of public health evidence, I'm delighted now to introduce you to our first presenter. Steph Burrell, from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in the USA, is now going to talk to us about the epidemiology and vulnerability of missing and indigenous populations. Thank you very much for your welcome. I look forward to speaking to you again later.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here in front of you today. And I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give the talk titled The Epidemiology and Vulnerability of Missing and Indigenous Populations. So I'm going to start by giving a brief acknowledgement, and I think really explains why it's me presenting here in front of you today and how I ended up here today. I'll give the briefest of overviews of the pandemic in 2018 because we think we've already heard from Minister Burt and Ms. Thayer on the situation. And I really focus my time on looking at case studies of the distributions of HIV risk and really the differential HIV risk that exists in every setting around the world, and then some quick thoughts on moving forward. So I wanted to start with thanks. I have had the great fortune of engaging with hundreds of people over the years, and the stories and the messages and the evidence that I'm going to present are really theirs and ones that they've shared with me. Some of the folks whose organizations are represented here continue to do this work. Some folks have not been able to, given a number of dynamics in terms of personal and otherwise. There are folks that have died over the years, and there are also folks who have been murdered for no other reason other than supporting members of their community. And so I hope to do their memories justice with some of the messages today. So as a brief overview, we know that HIV remains one of the fundamental infectious disease pandemics around the world today. There are 37 million people living with HIV. And although there is a lot of conversation, as we've just heard, about the end of AIDS and moving towards that, there were 1.8 million people who acquired HIV, or estimated to have acquired HIV in the last year. But I think due to the hard work of people in this room and people who are no longer with us, there are now nearly 22 million people estimated to be on treatment, of whom about 17.5 million are living normal lives with viral suppression. But the talk today is really going to focus on these gaps. The treatment gap that remains in terms of about 15 million people who required treatment, and also the 1.8 million new infections that happened over the last year. And so I'm going to get into it. I'm going to start by providing a brief overview and case study of adolescent girls and young women in Tanzania. So as the case has already been made today, we recognize that adolescent girls and young women acquire HIV in a much higher magnitude than do their male counterparts. This is updated data from the recently released UNAIDS report from the other day. And what you can see is that there remains this spike of new infections amongst those women 15 to 24 with their male counterparts acquiring HIV later on in their life life course. And data from 2012 really showed clear incidence data among women 15 to 24 of about 2.5% compared to about 0.5% among their male counterparts. But I think it's also important to say that there is no evidence of regional differences in why people choose to have consensual sex. People choose to have consensual sex for procreation, for pleasure, and for need. And I think really what does differ is needs differ, access to appropriate education and commodities differ, and obviously the HIV prevalence within sexual networks differ. And I think it's really some of these determinants that are really explaining why these epidemics are happening in Southern and Eastern Africa and not in other parts of the world. When we looked at the significant determinants of HIV, prevalent HIV infections among adolescent girls and young women across Southern and Eastern Africa, there are individual determinants, including alcohol and drug use, condom use, limited condom use with sexual partners, untreated STIs. There are, of course, network-level determinants in terms of age-disparate partnerships, knowing your partner's HIV status and then reporting multiple partners. And then, as we've heard so clearly today, there are these clear physical, structural determinants, including physical and sexual violence, and really how that impacts people's ability to negotiate condom use during sex. But I think it's also trying to understand how transactional sex among adolescent girls and young women really conflates these relationships and also potentiates these risks among adolescent girls and young women that report transactional sex. Where studied, and it is not in the vast majority of studies that look at adolescent girls and young women, it's not asked, but where it has been assessed, it is consistently associated with HIV risks. And so we did a quick meta-analysis of studies going back about 10 years, and you can see that there's about a 2 times increased HIV burden among adolescent girls and young women. And that's consistent across Southern and Eastern Africa. So together with the SAUTI program that's being implemented by JPIGO in Tanzania, we had an opportunity to look at data that evaluated this a little bit more closely. Because they're our DREAMS partner, so they address the needs of adolescent girls and young women, as well as being a key populations implementer. They had data that really looked at both ends of the spectrum. And so they had data on 20,000 adolescent girls and young women, of about 25%, about a quarter of whom reported transactional sex. And what you can see is this clear association with prevalent HIV infections among those that do report transactional sex. And that's also that when we look at age-disparate partnerships, we can see as well that higher numbers of sexual partners are clearly where the HIV risks are. And with those that report 5 and greater partners, that there was a 9 times increase in odds ratio. And basically that's where the vast majority of infections were. And I should say, even in the context of a friendly program, it's still difficult for people to report transactional sex. Similarly, looking at infections in the last year, they've seen that when you have adolescent girls and young women that report transactional sex, there's about a 1.5% incidence rate compared to about 0.8% of people who do not report transactional sex. And so I think that the message from this is really that there are over 3 million adolescent girls and young women in Tanzania, and I think really in a meaningful way understanding their risks is particularly important to responding to them. Moving on to people who inject drugs in the Russian Federation. When we look at new HIV cases in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, we know that 2 countries really bear the majority of infections in that region, and that is really Russia and the Ukraine. Whereas the epidemic is relatively stable in the Ukraine, looking at data from 2010 onwards, we know, and it's been widely documented, of these massive increases in new infections in the Russian Federation, with 103,000 infections assumed in the last year. And I think there's been sort of this conflation of now, is it a concentrated or a generalized epidemic? And that these are, as if that these are happening in parallel. And I think that the data don't really support that. I think when we look at the most recent prevalence data from across Russia, this was an integrated biobehavioral surveillance study done in 7 different districts, we see prevalence of between 48 to 75% among people who inject drugs, incredible burdens. Among MSM, as in many other parts of the world, we see high burdens of between 17 and 23%, and also among sex workers. But what's important also to consider is that people don't belong to a singular entity. People who use drugs also have sex, and that there is conflation about both people's parental and their sexual transmission risks. And actually, you know, whenever one has a good idea, it's always the case that you can find somebody who's already done it. And so when we looked at a Mills et al. Paper from some years ago, They evaluated this, and they actually predicted very nicely what was going to happen. And I should say this was back when one was allowed to use NIH dollars and USAID dollars to work in Russia. That's no longer the case. But when they looked at this, they found that, obviously the highest prevalence is among people who inject drugs parenterally, given this very efficient mode of transmission. But also with that unmet treatment needs and unmet prevention needs among people who inject drugs, you also have higher numbers of infections among sexual partners of people who inject drugs. And then downstream, you have also higher numbers of infections in much larger populations of sexual partners of those partners, i.e. downstream infections. And when you integrate the data from sexual partnerships and sexual transmission and parenteral transmission, one can start better estimating the distribution of risks among people living with HIV. And that is to say that about a quarter of the people are people who inject drugs. About a quarter are most likely people who are sexual partners of people who inject drugs. And then, of course, there is a large number of people who, because programs have disappeared, no longer report using drugs, but are found to be and known to be living with HIV. And then, as in many other parts of the world, gay men and other men who have sex with men are disproportionately affected. And that applies also for new infections. When we look at new infections, a larger proportion are among people who inject drugs. But you also have about 28% of the infections, or close to a third of the number of infections, related to clients and sexual partners of people who inject drugs. Infections among MSM. And really, it's only a few percent of the infections that are not so clear in terms of describing. And so I think it really highlights this dynamic that these are not independent, that these downstream infections are related to unmet prevention and treatment needs. Moving on to gay men and other men who have sex with men and transgender women in Senegal. So we updated this review recently that was published in The Lancet some years ago. And the point of this is that HIV disproportionately affects men who have sex with men around the world in very similar ways. That whether you look at North America, Central and South America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia, it's actually a very similar burden of HIV among MSM. And I think that's consistent with the fact that there is no evidence that there are regional differences in the diversity of sexual orientations or gender identity, that these things hold true across regions. But of course there are differences in terms of how people are able to live their lives, their outward sexual and gender expression, social acceptance, punitive and protective laws that allow people to engage in the relationships that they want to engage in. When we focus in on Sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen these gains in treatment across the world, and specifically across the continent. Mishra et al. Recently did a review of looking at the cascade data among MSM, and you can see that in total they estimate that about 8% of MSM are virally suppressed across the continent. So we recognize high burdens of HIV and very limited access to treatment. And so taking advantage of a very progressive government in Senegal that has allowed work to move forward, Peter Vickerman, Dauda Diouf, and Kumba Turikane and others really wanted to evaluate what is the dynamic of gay men and other men who have sex with men in Senegal. And so they built a meaningful model that integrates young and old cisgender men who have sex with men, transgender women, and looks at the interactions of the epidemic with other populations. They built a traditional model that includes both those who are uninfected, acutely infected, chronically, and on ART. And what they can see with the results of this is actually very similar to what you would see in most of the world. That between 1995 and 2015, if you look in blue, you see a higher burden and a higher attributable fraction among MSM to about 60 to 70% of the infections, specifically in Dakar, but really across the country, related to the unmet prevention and treatment needs among gay men and other MSM. And given this progressive response to sex work, to sort of overall infections, you've actually seen declines in prevalence across the board. And I actually think that you could be looking at a graph of Thailand, of the US, of other parts of the world, but here we are looking at a graph from Senegal. Eric Volz and others looked at this phylogenetically, so they looked at prevalence sequences that were collected specifically from MSM as well as those that were available in Los Alamos. And they see a very similar dynamic, that when you look at the attributable fraction using phylogenetic methods, you see that about 50% of the infections are attributable to the unmet prevention and treatment needs among MSM. And in the context of U equals U could be averted. But I would say that when we look at sort of this traditional framing of the relevance or the importance of gay men and other MSM to epidemics across Sub-Saharan Africa, This is a review done by Schuber, Mishra et al. It was updated from their review. And you see that that it is considered that MSM are not relevant across the continent. And really the highest estimate is in Kenya, where some of the best data are, but even there it's estimated that gay men and other MSM only make up about 16% of the infections. So moving on to indigenous communities in Latin America. So I want to start by saying that in terms of indigenous communities, I think across the board there are very limited data. The vast majority of data that do exist have been collected in high-income settings, including in my own Canada, in the US, in Australia. There are limited data from across the world. As was shared with me recently, the Tuareg across Western Africa, other communities in China. There's virtually no data available about those communities. And we know that even where there are data, and in countries that are considered relatively progressive, and where we're seeing overall declines, we're seeing increasing burdens among indigenous communities. In Saskatchewan, you're seeing incredible increases in risk, and really attributable to systematic racism in healthcare settings and across the board, and I think needs to be highlighted again in a setting that I think people would consider otherwise friendly. Same dynamic is happening in Australia, in a place that has really had a very limited HIV epidemic. Given a progressive response, there have been, Ward et al. Have shown significant increases among Aboriginal communities across the region. But I'm really going to focus in today on Latin America, where we see some of the starkest differences of HIV burden among indigenous communities. So this is a review that we did, and on the left-hand side of the graph, we're looking at the HIV prevalence ratio, so the prevalence among indigenous communities to that among sort of the national average. And what you can see are these incredible prevalence ratios of between 16 and 30 times higher burdens among indigenous communities. That is also the case among people living with HIV. While there's limited data, HIV-related mortality is much higher among indigenous communities than it is, with about a 3 to 5 times increase in HIV-related mortality. So not just on the acquisition side, but really on the limited access to treatment side. And when we focus in on Venezuela a little bit, I think people in this room recognize that Venezuela is a country in true crisis. And that doesn't just affect HIV, that affects life in general. We recognize here that there's been a 5 times increase in malaria incidence, but as with these things, we also see it play out in the HIV epidemic with a significant increase in AIDS-related deaths. And on the side, you see photos here saying that, that people can be killed with bullets, with hunger, but it's really in the absence of health services that there can be no life. Also, people waiting outside of a hospital for any health services. But in the context of Venezuela and Latin America, there actually was in the past a strong program. But that strong program has really excluded indigenous communities, the 2 largest of which are Wayuu and the Warao. In the Warao, a recent study showed about a 10% prevalence of HIV among about 600 people. And that has been associated with significant mobility, very limited HIV knowledge, and very limited access to any sort of HIV-related education. And when we did a review to try to understand HIV vulnerabilities among indigenous communities, proximally this looks very similar to other parts of the world, that there are similar and parental related risks to other people living with HIV. But that this differential burden is really driven by these structural realities, the systematic exclusion from any national prevention services, including identity cards and other ways of accessing services, and also exclusion from global guidance documents prioritizing indigenous communities. There's limited cultural relevance of the existing services. And then, of course, there are intersectional stigmas, some of which are indigenous specific, some of which are just more broad racism. And then, of course, there are within community stigmas, including two-spirit people, people who use drugs, sell sex, and are already living with HIV. And as we know, HIV does not discriminate, but in the absence of services, we're going to continue to see these epidemics. And then finally, female sex workers across Southern Africa. So Kate Shannon et al. Recently updated the call to action, which looked at understanding what is the status of the burden of HIV among sex workers around the world. And I think it is clear now that the epidemic among sex workers in Southern Africa is stark, is driven by both sort of biological and structural realities. But the best estimates now are that about 1/3 of sex workers are living with HIV across the region. But again, when we look at sort of this estimates of attributable fraction from modes of transmission studies on an annual basis, we actually see that sex workers are estimated to make up very little of the overall infections. Overall, we have, there's an estimate of somewhere between a few percent in Lesotho to about 15% of the infections attributable to sex work in the region. And I think even there in places like South Africa, do we want to close that door? Okay, good. So just to make this point, because I think it's an important one, that even in a setting where we know burden to be high, we know access to services to be limited, we see that using traditional annualized models, sex workers are not considered relevant in these epidemics. And that is, again, is a stark reality. But I want to explore this a little bit more as to maybe why we understand the epidemics in this way. In serodiscordant partnerships, which, by the way, I always think it's important to try to understand the primary risk factor or the primary acquisition risk in a serodiscordant partnership. But even in those partnerships, in a stable serodiscordant partnership, over a one-year basis, given that there are more of them, one would estimate that they would make up a larger attributable fraction as compared to a sex worker whose unmet prevention and treatment needs might result in an onward infection. But when we look at this over a longer time horizon, over a 5 and 10 and even 20-year time horizon, we see that in the context of stable partnerships, there is not a significant risk of onward transmission. And given the vast scope now of the vertical transmission programs that exist. But in the unmet needs of sex workers, you have significant onward transmission risks to their clients, to other female sex workers, to other female partners, etc. And that it highlights the importance of really understanding these epidemics in the long term. Sharmista Mishra et al. Have also really tried to understand better and tease apart the different types of sex workers that exist, and this vast demographic and epidemiological heterogeneity that exists, in terms of high volume and low volume sex workers, in terms of people who report high volumes and low volumes of transactional sex. And then of course people who have other jobs now and who no longer sell sex, or who no longer report transactional sex. And of course there are people who never reported transactional sex or sex work. And the same thing applies on men. There are people who are regular clients, who occasionally are clients. There are people who no longer are clients. And then of course there are people who never engaged in sex work. And when they looked at this, they also looked at time-varying determinants. And obviously, given, again, the sort of the programs that have existed based on the work of many people in this room, we've seen these massive increases in condom use from the 80s all the way through to 2016. And that's true both in sex work partnerships as well as in the context of main and casual partnerships. And of course, again, as has already been said, we've seen massive increases in treatment availability. But even there, we know that the treatment cascade lags for sex workers given some of these structural realities in the context of engagement in care and services. And when they looked at this then over the long term, you see that on a one-year time horizon, it's about the same, that about 8% of the infections in sort of the wider population, not including sex work, is attributable to the unmet prevention treatment needs among sex workers. But when you look at this over a longer time horizon, using data from Swaziland or Eswatini, Lesotho, and South Africa, you see that about 40% of the infections are due to the unmet treatment needs. And again, in the context of U, because U could really be avoided. So I think just some quick case study messages. I think in the context of these really high order prevention programs like PrEP, and the vast millions and millions of adolescent girls and young women that are doing fine and have no HIV risks across Southern and Eastern Africa, it is important to understand whose risks are real and who is deserving and who actually needs these really intense interventions. In terms of people who inject drugs in Eastern Europe, I think it is clear that we are not talking about parallel epidemics, and that we shouldn't use the language of generalized epidemic to forget the needs of those most affected. And that most of these infections really are downstream infections from the unmet prevention and treatment needs among people who inject drugs and other key populations. In terms of gay men and other men who have sex with men and trans women across sub-Saharan Africa, I think we need to move past these sort of preconceived notions of the epidemiology of HIV. And I think we need to, in an open and competent way, assess people's risks and then address them appropriately, no matter what the geography and no matter what the social context. In terms of indigenous communities, I think, as is noted, HIV doesn't discriminate. But systematic barriers to engagement in national health programs is going to result in sustained and expanding epidemics among indigenous communities. And finally, female sex workers in Southern Africa. I think it is clear now that 40 years into this pandemic, we need to take a longer view of transmission dynamics in terms of understanding and informing responses for meaningful scale-up of prevention treatment services. So then just some quick closing thoughts. HIV is not Zika. There is not a city or country or place in this world where risks are evenly distributed in the population. And I think that it is time that we start moving away from this term of the general population. Because I think it's fundamentally important to understand who and why people are living with HIV, irrespective of where you are, because I think it allows you to serve that person better and to do better programming. Thank you.
To introduce our next plenary speakers, please welcome to the stage Her Excellency, the First Lady of Namibia, Madame Monica Gengos.
Good morning. When I listened to Charlize Theron speak about privilege, I had to review my own, because the reason I'm standing in front of you today is because I married a head of state. Now, first ladies in general, the only real power we have is that we don't have to make an appointment to see the president. So, but as Charlize said, with any privilege comes responsibility. So anybody who has proximity to power, which many of you have, you need to use it responsibly. And as many First Ladies in Africa, and that's why we have the Organization of African First Ladies Against AIDS, we use our proximity to power to address difficult social issues. One, and the obvious, being HIV, particularly to the extent that it affects adolescent girls and young women. One of the things, like with Charlize, that First Ladies have, you have immediate social capital. So once you become a First Lady, you become immediately popular. And once you're no longer First Lady, you're not popular anymore. So while you're popular and you have social capital, like with any capital, you have to spend it. So you have to spend it talking about difficult topics, especially in an African context. One of the difficult topics that we see increasingly is the way that inequality interacts with every single social reality we have in our country. It's easy to speak about HIV, but it's not so easy to speak about how inequality drives that, how adolescent girls and the relationship with transactional sex is driven by poverty. So if we don't fix these structural inequalities that we have, we're not really going to make ground in preventing adolescent girls and young women from being exposed to HIV, particularly by older men. So when we speak about the human rights-focused approach of HIV, we also need to speak about how it's driven by poverty, inequality, and the need to transform our economies so that they start to reflect the demographic diversity of our nations. It's against this backdrop that in our global quest towards a more effective HIV response, we remain steadfast in our efforts to shift from focusing solely on HIV/AIDS and working more generally towards a more inclusive and transformed economic structure, while also integrating health systems and strengthening them. This will also require that besides government and development partners, that civil society and HIV activists expand on the gains of the HIV/AIDS response and promote a rights-based response to other health issues and economic issues in ensuring that we leave nobody behind. With these few words, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Anna Dirabayina from Kazakhstan, as well as Olena Strezek from the Ukraine, to speak to us about their experiences.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm honored to participate in the plenary and talk about different ways we can optimize HIV prevention and treatment outcomes for people with substance abuse. In my presentation today, I will talk very briefly about the magnitude of substance use in HIV globally, intersection between substance use and HIV, different service delivery models to optimize HIV cascade for people who inject drugs, as well as challenges to effective HIV epidemic control in this population and ways forward. So it is estimated that 250 million people in the world use drugs, with distribution of use of specific drugs noted in the figure on the right. Almost 30 million people suffer from drug use disorders, and approximately 13 million people inject drugs. In addition, more than 3 million people die from harmful use of alcohol every year. There is a strong link between HIV and substance use that is also supported by epidemiological data. It is estimated that as much as 1.7 million people who inject drugs are living with HIV. As you can see on the graph, on sub-regional level, countries of South and Eastern Europe have both one of the highest number of people who inject drugs, represented by the green outer circle, as well as the number of people who inject drugs who are living with HIV, represented by the white inner circle. Use of drugs is associated with increased risk of sexual transmission, with people who use psychoactive substances are more likely to practice risky sexual behavior such as unprotected sex and sex with multiple partners. In addition, it is estimated that people who inject drugs have 24 times higher risk of HIV acquisition compared to general population. Along with the increased risk of contracting HIV, use of opioids may lead to increased immunosuppression among people living with HIV, causing higher rates of opportunistic infections, including tuberculosis. The impaired judgment and mental effects of substance use also create difficulties in maintaining a consistent HIV treatment. And finally, stigma and discrimination associated with the use of illicit drugs often create significant barriers for people trying to access HIV prevention, care, and treatment services in many countries around the world. On this slide, you can see some data to support the observations I just shared with you. The table here shows the results of a retrospective cross-sectional analysis of routinely collected data on ART-naive patients that started therapy in Kazakhstan. Reporting injecting drug use and harmful alcohol use were associated with discontinuation of therapy within the first 12 months of ART initiation. Beyond opioid dependence and alcohol use, use of other substances has also been associated with risk of HIV. Several studies have shown that sexualized drug use, or chemsex, practiced by gay, bisexual, and other MSM increases risk of HIV transmission and reduces ART adherence. In the table on this slide is an example of one recently published study from 2 clinics in London. As you can see in the middle column, the percentage of men reporting risky sexual behaviors and injecting drug use was higher among those reporting chemsex. Key populations face particular challenges from the perspective of both HIV prevention as well as HIV care continua. Starting on the left on this slide is the bar in dark blue representing key populations. As you will note, moving from the left to the right of the slide, there are multiple steps where challenges are faced in engaging such populations, from reaching them to accessing to HIV testing, enrolling them in care, initiating ILT, and achieving and maintaining viral load suppression at the end of HIV care continuum. This graph demonstrates the difference between HIV care continuum, contrasting it among people living with HIV who inject drugs, the column in red, with people who did not report injecting drugs, the column in blue. People living with HIV who inject drugs tend to be enrolled in HIV care less often and are less likely to be effectively initiated and retained on ART compared to those who don't. I will focus now on some innovations to address the gaps in this continuum. Making sure people know their HIV status is the first step in the cascade. An approach to optimizing HIV case finding was implemented by the Alliance for Public Health in Ukraine, which can serve as an example of a potential solution to increase HIV testing coverage among people who inject drugs. The model is based on conditional chain referral sampling, where HIV-positive individuals identified through harm reduction programs are incentivized to refer their peers for HIV testing. Recruitment stops if two HIV-negative cases are consecutively noted in a chain. This model allowed reaching periods that were not using the existing harm reduction services before. Thus, as you can see here at the bottom of the slide, while the HIV testing yield for standard outreach program was 1 to 2%, the optimized case finding increased the yield to up to 16%. And more than 60% of people living with HIV who were newly identified as part of the intervention had never been tested before. Another approach that holds promise as a way to reach people who are not accessing existing HIV services, including people who inject drugs, is HIV self-testing. In this figure, which shows findings from a study conducted in Vietnam, presented at IAS 2017, the findings were really encouraging. The results showed that HIV self-testing was acceptable among people who inject drugs. As shown here, learning how to use the test and privacy and confidentiality of HIV self-testing were the key reasons for people to choose HIV self-testing. Another example of innovations for case finding is shown on this slide. Getting young people experimenting with different drugs engaged in harm reduction and HIV testing services is another challenge to ensure effective HIV cascade. The Alliance in Ukraine recently launched a novel intervention that specifically targets young people experimenting with different drugs. It's called Drugstore, and it provides access to online counseling and information about sexual health, substance use, and HIV testing. To attract youth, the program will soon start providing a drug check-in service to inform the users about the composition of the drugs and therefore advise them on less risky taking of said substances. But now let's move to innovations to support adherence to ART and viral load suppression, a challenge faced by many people who inject drugs living with HIV. In 2018, ICAP at Columbia University in Central Asia launched a nurse-led home-based adherence support intervention targeting people living with HIV who were on IRT for 6 and more months but did not have viral load suppression. In this figure, you can see the percentage of these patients that achieved viral load suppression after just 3 months of participating in the program. In red are figures for people who inject drugs, and in blue for people who did not report injecting drug use behavior. As you can see here, in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, the proportion of patients who became virally suppressed was even higher among PUID than among non-PUID, showing the effectiveness of this intervention in ensuring viral load suppression among all patients, including people who inject drugs. Of course, these are early data and more long-term data are awaited. Opioid agonist therapy or opioid substitution therapy, OST programs, are not novel. From a number of meta-analyses published back in 2011-2012, we know that OST decreases HIV transmission and HIV incidence among people who inject opioids by reducing injecting drug use and reducing sharing of injecting equipment. A more recent report, a systematic review and meta-analysis published in 2016, also found strong evidence of the positive impact of OST on ART initiation, ART adherence, viral load suppression, and ART discontinuation. The same study also found that OST markedly improves the HIV prevention benefit of ART for prevention. Another intervention aimed at enhancing ART initiation and virus suppression among people living with HIV who inject drugs is integration of OST and ART service delivery. On this slide, you can see results of integrated delivery of HIV and OST that is supported by ICAP at several sites in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. Intervention sites are shown in blue columns and non-intervention sites in red. On the left side of the figure, you can see that after 4 years of implementation, the proportion of people living with HIV on OST and ART increased both for prevention and for intervention and non-intervention sites. However, on the right side of the figure, you will note that the proportion of people living with HIV on OST and ART that were virally suppressed increased over time in intervention sites, but decreased in non-intervention sites. Excited results were presented at CROI earlier this year from 2 studies that showed a positive effect of extended-release naltrexone on viral load suppression. Naltrexone is an opioid antagonist that's available in long-acting formulations. Both studies were multi-site, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that compared extended-release naltrexone with placebo among incarcerated people living with HIV, with opioid dependence or alcohol use disorders, transitioning to community over a 6-month period. On the left side of the figure, comparing naltrexone arm in dark blue with the placebo in light blue, you will note that there was an increase in viral load suppression in the naltrexone arm from baseline to 6 months at both thresholds of less than 50 copies per milliliter and less than 200 copies per milliliter. On the right side of the figure, you will note that persons in the naltrexone arm were more likely to improve and maintain viral load suppression compared to those in a placebo arm, whereas more people in the placebo arm lost achieved viral load suppression. But now, what about the HIV-negative prevention continuum for people who inject drugs? There is a lot of global excitement now regarding the promise of pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP for prevention of HIV acquisition among individuals at substantial risk. The Bangkok PrEP trial among a large cohort of prospectively followed people who inject drugs, published in 2013, demonstrated 70% reduction of HIV acquisition risk among PIWID with detectable tenofovir levels, as noted in the table on the right side of this slide. However, implementation of PrEP among PIWID is still very rare. On this slide, you can see a cover of a report from several consultations with people who inject drugs conducted over the past 2 years. Results of these consultations show that PrEP is not always supported by this population, fearing that its implementation may shift the focus away from harm reduction initiatives, such as needle and syringe program, OST, and naloxone. So while innovations are urgently needed to confront the threat of HIV among substance users, there is an equally urgent need to expand what we know works, existing evidence-based interventions. According to a study published in 2017 that included a review of published and read literature, less than 1% of people who inject drugs lived in countries with high coverage of both NSP and OST. Countries with higher numbers of PIWID, including China, the US, Myanmar, Ukraine, and several other countries from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, where I come from, had low NSP and low OST coverage. Of particular concern, Russia has an estimated 1.9 million PIWID, 30% of whom are estimated to be living with HIV. This was and still is the only country in the Eastern European region that does not provide OST, and access to NST is still very limited. So to achieve HIV epidemic control globally, we need innovations and new models how to optimize HIV prevention and treatment for PIWID. Ultimately, to reach and engage people with substance use disorders, there is a need for tailored services and interventions that we call differentiated service delivery, DSD. On the left side of this slide is a list of necessary elements of such services for all PIWIDs, and on the right, additional services specific to HIV-positive and HIV-negative people who inject drugs. In many countries, we need political will to ensure access of people who inject drugs to basic harm reduction interventions, such as needle and syringe programs and opioid maintenance programs. In places where services are available, there is a need to bring them to scale and to achieve the necessary coverage. People living with HIV must be enabled to access effective antiretroviral therapy and receive adherent support regardless of their substance use. So in conclusion, reaching high coverage for prevention and treatment remains a challenge for people with substance use disorders. There is an urgent need to provide combination of evidence-based biomedical, behavioral, and structural interventions in a manner that is appropriate and sensitive to the need of the populations to be served. Designing, implementing, and evaluating DSD models is a critical priority for this group. We also need to ensure that all interventions are developed and implemented with active community engagement and support to understand specific needs of target populations and subpopulations, like, for example, substance-using youth and women, and the challenges they face when seeking healthcare services. Finally, human rights must be prioritized over political agendas and rigid moralistic attitudes. Thank you. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Elena Strizhak, who will talk more about the community involvement. Thank you.
I am HIV positive woman. I got infections through drug injections and shared needles. At the time of infection, I had no knowledge about HIV. Reasonably, I strongly support comprehensive, gender-oriented harm reduction services that have proven to be highly effective in prevention HIV and other diseases. We need to keep track and strengthening efforts in harm reduction because without it, HIV epidemic cannot be stopped, nor in our region, neither in globally. Decriminalization of use and possession of drugs, adoption of supportive legislation framework for harm reduction is vital for reducing HIV transmission. Despite of all pledges of combat AIDS among people who use drugs, scale and scope of harm reduction services remain extremely insufficient. 68 out of 155 AIDS countries where injection drugs use is reported still not provide needles and syringes program, while opioid substitution therapy has been initiated in only 3 new countries. Harm reduction is underfunded. In 2016, the allocated amount for harm reduction projects was 15 times less than it needed. Less than 8% of global spending for drug control directed to harm reduction can decrease number of new HIV cases and HIV-related deaths for more than 90% by 2030. An estimated $100 billion is currently spent on global drug enforcement and control, while only $160 million is spent on harm reduction. We call on member states to redirect 10% of their annual drug control spending towards harm reduction to reach higher coverage of life-saving services. Recently, new psychoactive substances become seriously a challenge for the national public health system, local NGOs, communities in the region of Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Use of new psychoactive substances has led to new threats for health: overdose, psychotic reaction, high HIV risks due multiple injections, increased number of sexual contacts and likeliness of unprotected sex. However, in many countries, service providers are not ready to deal with use of new drugs. Use of new drugs is typical for young men and women, but other age groups can be also involved. They are cheaper than natural drugs and more attractive and affordable for young people. OST and Aloxone provision are not effective. Needle and syringes program are relevant for new psychoactive substances, but the number of syringes needed is considerably higher than in case of opioid use. We suggest a list of effective harm reduction intervention targeting those who use of new psychoactive substances. Provision of information about each substance available on local drug scenes and its side effect to drug user and service providers. Make services available in nightlife settings. Provide drug tests for harm reduction clients and in nightclub to ensure users know what they consume and are empowered to make safe choices. Good coverage of existing needle exchanging services and increase the number of syringes per person for those who inject new psychoactive substances. Promote self-help and exchange reliable information between users. Promote drug consumption rooms. Establish close cooperation between toxicological laboratories and medical institutions, providing care to users in cases of overdose. Train service providers, including ambulance staff, in particular, how to communicate with the new psychoactive substances users and educate them about new substances. Even when HIV prevention services are available, the quality of programs is often inadequate. As a result of there is late detection, poor retention in care, hence leading to increased morbidity and mortality. There are examples of good practices from around the world that can be used for planning programs and services for people who use drugs. People who use drugs in all their diversity need engage in strong, focused advocacy and negotiate it with decision makers to address these significant challenges, as well as continue to fight for their right to engage in the planning, implementation and monitoring of national HIV responses. Compulsory drug detention centers are common throughout Asia. At the same time, treatment methods such as OST are generally unavailable on these settings. Comprehensive analysis of outcome of treatment in different facilities in Malaysia showed that relapse rate among patients completed treatment in compulsory drug detention centers is significantly higher than in voluntary centers. In many countries, HIV prevalence among women who inject drugs is significantly higher than in men, especially where harm reduction services are not widely available. In Eastern Europe, less than 1% of women who inject drugs have access to OST. Moreover, access to sexual and reproductive health services is very limited for them. Vertical transmission of HIV among women who use drugs is significantly higher than among other women living with HIV. Gender inequality and punitive legislation affecting women who use drugs reinforce each other. Structural gender inequality impedes the development of effective drug policies and adequately address the right of women. Violence and stigma and stereotypes faced by women who use drugs are accelerated. Little attention has been paid to gender differences in drug use. 1/3 of all people who use drugs are women and girls, yet only 1 of 5 of those who receive treatment are. Although men are more likely to use drugs, the combined harm and risk connected to drug use are higher in women. Women living with HIV who experience violence are less likely to access HIV care and participate in HIV prevention and drug treatment services. In addition to this, data suggests that the addiction progresses faster among women than among men. Clinical trials and in research are largely centered on men. More research is required for studied biological impact of drug use on women. The experience of women who use drugs and those living with HIV is compounded by poor access to maternal health care and other human rights violations. Women face greater barriers than men to accessing drug treatment and rehabilitation services. In addition, stigma leaves women who use drugs reluctant to seek medical services. Harm reduction programs rarely support women's personal safety and confidentially, do not provide sexual and reproductive health services or prevention of vertical transmission and child care. National responses to people who use drugs are often distributive. We advocate for the decriminalization of people who use drugs and calls for policy reform to guide treatment and prevention. Draconian laws in many regions, particularly in Eastern Europe and Asia, continue to punish and imprison women for possession and use of drugs. Women who use drugs are afraid to protect own rights. In 2016, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs called for gender mainstreaming in drug policies and stressed the need to involve women at all stages of development, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of drug policies and programming. The UN rule, so-called Bangkok Rules 2011, reinforced the importance of gender-sensitive policies on people who use drugs. Although these policies oblige member states to implement gender responses in drug policies, implementation lags behind with little reform and no consideration to scale up gender-sensitive drug policies. A few countries made law reform. For example, Bolivia made this year changes in criminal code and reduced sentences for women. We need governments to undertake following steps: provide funding and ensure access to comprehensive health care services, including sexual and reproductive health, hepatitis, HIV prevention strategies, especially in prisons. Develop mechanisms that guarantee personal safety and privacy that allows women to report incidents of violence without fear. Ensure cases of violence and any unlawful actions are investigated, including those committed by health care providers, social workers, law enforcement officials. Provide access to state legal assistance for women who use drugs in case of violation of their rights. Engage women who use drugs monitoring of progress in implementation of recommendation made through UNGAS policy around gender in drugs policy. Improve legal framework to ensure continuous substitution therapy for women who use drugs. Secure access and availability to integrate services including support and OST during and post-pregnancies. We need researchers to capture the diversity of women who use drugs and that recognizes the intersectionally within different population of women who use drugs. Focus on women who use drugs, including LGBTI communities, women who are in prison, women living with HIV and sex workers. We need donors too. Encourage countries to support human rights and evidence-based intervention for women who use drugs, strengthening the capacity and engage women who use drugs in Global Fund-supported programs. Support community-driven research that collects and explores qualitative data to address and improve the lives of women who use drugs. And at the end of my presentation, I would like to stress that in war on drugs and combating HIV epidemic, often regular people suffer, and most of them are women. Chase the virus. Not people. Chase the virus. Not people. Chase the virus. Not people.
To introduce our final speakers, please welcome back the Right Honourable Alistair Burt.
And now for something a little less dramatic. Can I thank both Anna and Elena for their presentations? Anna for a thoroughly researched piece of work, explanatory to all of us, and Elena for a powerful polemic against injustice against women. Thank you very much. I'm now very pleased to introduce to you our final speakers, Alan Malechi and Robert Suttle, who are going to present on putting HIV science into the criminal justice system, a very important and timely topic. Alan and Robert. Thank you very much.
It's good to be back here. It feels like yesterday. So this morning I'm privileged to be back on this stage to speak to you about a very important topic that was last spoken in August 2008 at the Mexico International AIDS Conference, where in a closing plenary, Justice Edwin Cameron, who you may all know is a judge in the Constitutional Court of South Africa and the only highest-ranking African official who has come public about his HIV status, inspired us to a political call of action towards addressing the issue of deliberate infection. I stand here to speak about what has happened since then and to also have my own call to action so that we can finally put to rest the bed, this thorn that we call HIV criminalization. I trust that you will be persuaded to join me in this journey and ensure that the next time we are speaking on the podium about this topic, we have fought the fight against bad laws in the era of HIV. I'll not have the privilege of a PowerPoint presentation, but this is how I plan to walk you through this conversation. We will have a quick one-on-one so that we're all on the same page on what HIV criminalization is. We will quickly walk through what the successes have been, and then we will see what is left for us to be able to take forward. And this will not be a high-level talk. I will end the talk with practical recommendations for everyone in this room that you can leave and be able to take forward to put words into action and for us to be able to see change. So let me start talking by what do we mean when we talk about HIV criminalization. HIV criminalization is the use of unjust laws or applying unjustly a criminal law to people living with HIV based solely on their HIV status. This could be a specific criminal law targeted for HIV, or it could be a general criminal law that does not specifically mention issues of HIV. So what does the law then punish? The law punishes non-disclosure. If you're HIV positive and you fail to disclose to your partner, then in certain jurisdictions, the law does punish that. In other jurisdictions, the law punishes exposure. You do an act, you do something that puts the other person at a risk of getting infected, then you can be punished by the law. Thirdly, what does the law again punish? Transmission, where there is actual transmission and the other person gets infected. So those are the three things that the law seeks to punish. And the basis of these laws is very irrational. It is based on fear, which leads to stigma, which eventually manifests itself in terms of discrimination. There is no legal or scientific basis of having these laws on the book. And so, what positive things have happened since Justice Edwin called us into action? They say charity begins at home, and I will begin with a successful Kenyan case that challenged one of the many laws in Kenya that was criminalizing exposure and non-disclosure. This is Section 24 of the HIV and AIDS Prevention and Control Act, and three judges, Justice Isaac Lenaola, Justice George Odunga, and Judge Mombi Gugi, struck down that law on a suit that was brought by the AIDS Law Project in Kenya, where they say that the law was vague, the law was unconstitutional, it violated the right to privacy, because in that law it said if a person knew their HIV status, they had an obligation to inform their sexual contact of their HIV status, and that they had an obligation to make efforts to ensure that they do not put the other person at a risk of getting infected. So the law placed the entire obligation on the person who was living with HIV. And the law further on went to say that if the person did not want to disclose, the healthcare worker was then mandated to disclose on behalf of that person whether they liked it or not. Gladly, the Kenyan High Court has struck down that law, one of the many successes. We've also had tremendous success, and I would urge you to have a look at this publication by UNDP on the Global Commission on Law and HIV, which rightfully tells us that we have had success in the repeal of certain criminal laws. And we must appreciate the following countries that I'm going to name that have been able to repeal the criminal laws since 2008 when Justice Edwin Cameron last spoke to us. Ghana, Greece, Honduras, Kenya, Malawi, Mongolia, Switzerland, Tajikistan, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and at least 2 states in the US, including California and Iowa, who have been able to repeal laws that put people living with HIV at a risk. Let's congratulate those countries. So we know science has taught us a lot since HIV came in the 1980s. We now know if people take their ARVs, suppress their viral load, they are unable to put other people at a risk of getting infected. We know science has taught us that people living with HIV can live a normal life and that HIV is no longer a death threat. But more still needs to be done, because the application of this law irrationally is still continuing even as we speak. Even though we know what science says, even though we know what the law says, even though we know there are decisions that say that this is not the right way to go, these laws are being applied in this day and age of time. And to demonstrate that, I will quickly run you to 3 cases in 3 different African countries for you to appreciate this perspective. Allow me to take you to my neighboring country, Uganda, and bring to you the very painful story of a 64-year-old nurse called Rosemary Nambiru, a grandmother, a mother, a member of the International AIDS Society, and a nurse who had served her life. In 2014, while drawing blood from an infant, the 67-year-old nurse had a needle stick injury, and she was falsely or wrongly accused of intentionally exposing a child to HIV while administering an injection. She was arrested on live TV, she was paraded in front of live media, and the initial charge against her was attempted murder. Take into account that the child was never infected with HIV. She was taken to a magistrate's court, the charges were changed to aggravated assault, and she was eventually imprisoned for 3 years. Her sentence was appealed thanks to colleagues in Uganda from ICW, from Uganet and Sehud, and even when their decision was appealed, she had already spent 5 months in remand serving her sentence. And even when you look at the appeal decision, the judge doesn't strike down the law, but says that the sentence was too harsh and reduces the sentence to the period she has served in the remand so that she can be released. But what I want to bring out of this story, apart from all the mishaps in the legal, is the role of the media. Rose's life has been tarnished. The headlines were "Killer Nurse Arrested," and even after she was released by the court, the next headline was "HIV Murderer Nurse Released." So the media, you have a role to shape the lives of people. You can destroy it or you can create it, and Rosemary case provides an avenue. Luckily, there's a toolkit by HIV Justice Network that the media can turn to be able to ensure they get the messaging right. I now want to move you to Malawi, a very lovely country in the heart of Southern Africa. And I want to bring to your attention a case, EL versus the state. This case speaks to a woman who is living with HIV and on antiretroviral treatment, who was charged of unlawful, negligent, and reckless conduct likely to spread a disease dangerous to life. What was her crime? During a community meeting, she accidentally breastfed another person's child. The child did not contract HIV, and the evidence on record shows that it was accidental. On a plea of guilty because she was not represented in court by anyone, She was sentenced to 9 months in prison and hard labor. Can you imagine that? But gladly, thanks to the work of a brilliant organization in Southern Africa called SALC, who have invested in training lawyers with support from the Global Fund, were able to train lawyers from 10 African countries, and one of them included my learned colleague, Wesley Mwafurila. Wesley, who picked up this story in the media, took up the appeal before the court and took it before a judge who had also been part of a training funded by the Global Fund, administered by UNDP, to argue the case, brought forth to the court evidence about what is the risk of transmission through breastfeeding, brought in evidence from experts who knew about HIV and the law, like Michaela Clayton, to explain to the court. And based on that, the court overturned the decision and set this woman free. Would you imagine a lady who has to breastfeed a child would now be languishing in jail had it not been for legal intervention from lawyers and judges who knew about the law? So this proves to the point that funders, you must invest in structural remedies. You must invest in structural barriers to HIV. The Global Fund is doing it. Nothing stops PEPFAR from doing it, and nothing stops the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from funding human rights work. I began by saying charity starts at home, and I want to end with a case from Kenya. This is as recent as 4 months ago, and a case currently happening in one of our counties called Kericho. We have the case of a gentleman, E.W., whose name we cannot release for purposes of confidentiality. But he's a 30-year-old man who was arrested by police on an evening. And while he was resisting arrest and in the struggle to have him arrested, he beat the thumb of the police officer. And when that happened, he was violently assaulted. And from what we have on record, they took him to a hospital, and he was tested for HIV without his consent, and he only came to learn about his HIV status in court when the charges were being read to him, and he was charged under Section 26 of the Sexual Offences Act, where he was charged with deliberately infecting a police officer with a deadly disease. Remember, HIV is not a death sentence. Remember, science has shown us that the risk in transmitting HIV through biting is very negligible or almost impossible. Take back the first case we had in Texas in the US, where a man was sentenced to 35 years in jail for spitting at a police officer, and juxtapose it with what is happening in Kericho. And that is why we are saying work still needs to be done. So what are my recommendations going forward? I will start with the donors because they are the purse holders of this important money. Donors, you need to fund the right work. You need to fund sensitization of communities. Communities need to know their rights. Communities need to know where do you go when your rights have been violated. You need to fund sensitization programs for lawyers, for judges, for law enforcement officers, for healthcare workers, and even parliamentarians, so that they can understand what is the implication of some of these laws and what do they have to take into account when they are deciding cases, when they are representing clients, when they are arresting clients, when they are providing healthcare services, and when they are debating in their parliaments around this particular issue. So donors, please invest in the right programs. UNAIDS has a fantastic 7-guide program that you could consider and invest. And if we can invest in the 68 countries in the world that still have laws that criminalize people who are living with HIV, we will be speaking a different story. To the judges in the room, I must say, leaving this room, and if you go back to your homes and you have a case you're going to listen to, apply science, apply the law, apply rationality, and be able to ensure that you make a decision that takes the rights-based approach into interest. And if you're a lawyer in this room and you get a case, you must think it through, you must consult, and you must put forward the right evidence and case before the court. because a judge is only good as the lawyer who appears before him. So if you bring a bad case, you will get a bad judgment. If you bring a good case, you will get a good judgment. And to the law enforcement officers in the room, yes, you have to enforce the law, but you have to be able to see, am I paying rationale to the law that is in place? You know what science says, you know the effect of that. Would you want to have a mind shift in the way you enforce some of these particular laws? To the members who represent government in the ministries of health, in the National AIDS Control Council, what you have a role to ensure that our policies are pushing more for information and rights-based information to people who are living with HIV and communities around this. I've already spoken to the media. You have a role to communicate the right message and to do it in a very responsible way. And I cannot miss the opportunity to communicate to the First Ladies, of whom we've learned do not need an appointment to the heads of state, that you would be able to raise these issues at the highest level and know that certain laws would hinder this coming into place. I have saved the best for last, and this is to the scientists who probably are the most in this room. There's going to be an expert consensus statement that will be made public tomorrow, and this statement has been developed by a number of experts and endorsed by many of them. This statement has been developed largely to break down what does science say about the risk of transmission. So to the doctors, to the epidemiologists, to the nurses, any healthcare worker in the room, my plea to you is that look out for this statement and help out back in your country by providing expert affidavit evidence for those who are taking forward cases, for those who are writing policies, for you to be able to take that forward. So as I conclude, I want to end with two quotes. One from my favorite publication, and the Bible I ask you to look at, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. If you want to know anything about HIV and the law, this is the Bible. If you're a funder and if you want to find anything about HIV and the law, and TB and hepatitis, this is the Bible. So I will read two quotes so that I can be able to ensure the message gets home, and I will be done. So from the Global Commission report, the law alone cannot stop AIDS, nor can the law alone be blamed when HIV responses are inadequate. But the legal environment can play a powerful role in the well-being of people living with HIV and those vulnerable to HIV. Good laws, fully resourced and rigorously enforced, can widen access to prevention and healthcare services, improve the quality of treatment, enhance social support for people affected by the epidemic, protect human rights that are vital to survival, and save the public money. And to my final quote, and in honor of the award I got yesterday, as Elizabeth Taylor said from this podium in 1992, we are here to fight the virus, not to fight the people. HIV is not a crime. Thank you for listening to me.
Good morning. I am Robert Suttle. I am not a criminal, but I've served 6 months in the Louisiana State Prison on an HIV non-disclosure charge. Now I am based in New York. I'm Assistant Director of the Cyril Project and coordinate a network of HIV criminalization survivors, people who have been threatened or are currently being prosecuted for HIV crime. Cyril is a US-based network of people living with HIV and allies fighting for HIV-related stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. Here's a picture of my mugshot, which I've never really shared publicly with anyone, but I decided to do it for this occasion. As you see at the top, that is the statute under which I was prosecuted under, intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. A former partner filed charges against me after we broke up. As a result of that experience, I accepted a felony plea bargain, served 6 months in prison, and had to register as a sex offender for 15 years. So I thought I was not the lucky one. But however, it turns out that I am. Compared that there are many who have received much harsher sentences. And as pictured here, Michael Johnson, who is in the state of Missouri, is currently incarcerated, initially received 30-year sentences. However, his case was overturned under appeal, and he's now has agreed to a plea bargain of 10 years. And we also have Kerry Thomas, who is currently incarcerated in the Idaho Correctional Center, who's also a serial board member, currently facing 30 years. Kerry is HIV positive, but the virus is undetectable. He used a condom and didn't transmit HIV to anyone. He will not be out of prison until 2038, and it is currently 2018. So he's already 8 years, at least 8 years into that 30-year sentence. So it doesn't end upon release. There are social consequences that occur, and there's also sex offender registration. And then there's also the day-to-day life difficulty around employment, housing, traveling, even voting in some places, and even receiving government benefits. There is the social stigma and the loss of privacy, outing HIV status and sexual orientation to family and friends. When this experience happened to me, I was not out about my sexuality, nor did I share with my family about my HIV status. At a young age, I was always taught personal responsibility, and so when this happened to me, I knew that I had to do what I had to do, and that was to take care of myself. And I knew how to do that. I knew how to go to appointments. I knew how to take medication. And so I felt like I didn't need to share that information with my family. However, when the prosecution happened, everything came out. I didn't really have to say one word. Thankfully, it was not all in the media, but there was a publication that showed that my photo, as well as the fact that I had been prosecuted. To me, that was enough. Other people, by chance, experienced other social media embarrassment. And many of you may have seen flyers or pictures of people's faces who've been prosecuted flashing across your Facebook timeline or even in your news media. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because it only further stigmatizes the individual and also sends the wrong messages to the public about what this person is actually being accused of. And also it exposes their HIV status. Other consequences that I've even experienced is makes dating difficult. A lot of times I found that it was going to be challenging to share about myself with someone, not only telling them that I was HIV positive, but also going further to say that I was also prosecuted, and thinking about, oh my God, what would they think about that? You know, what would they think about me? And so, in essence, it does make it difficult to really meet people and to be open. Notice I didn't say honest, but at least open about something that's very personal and private about your life, because you never know how people are going to receive you. There's the constant threat of prosecution, where it's used as a tool for abuse or control. The worst thing that you can do for a person living with HIV or any other person that has history of trauma and violence in their life is to call the police on them. I've had that happen to me before, and it does not feel good, and it definitely sends the wrong message, because if a police officer or a law enforcement officer was to show up, who do you think that they will believe? Particularly someone that has a record or a felony record already, and yet you're not the person that initiated the violence or the aggression, but simply because of what you have or how you're labeled, whether it be a convicted felon or someone who is formerly incarcerated, those things can have a negative stigma to them, and a person's life can continue to further be damaged. And then there's also the mental health challenges. Although I'm standing here before you telling you about something so private and so personal about myself, that's not always easy for a lot of people who've experienced prosecution. A lot of times they don't want to be exposed sharing this information because of the trauma of what they've already gone through. However, I didn't recognize it as much as trauma for myself, but I have come to accept that it is trauma, Because as I continue to live out each day of my life, I have to wonder, am I going to be able to have housing? Am I going to be able to keep a job? Or am I going to continue to, or is the police going to come knocking on my door from someone accusing me of God knows what? So I wanted to say that also with the survivors that I know, a lot of them have attempted suicide or considered it, or come to terms with some addiction issues. And so it's not really easy because, as we all should know, that any person that uses drugs or perhaps having sex or whatever their coping mechanism is, it's their way of coping with a lot of times with life and a lot of times what we as people in society throw at them. And it doesn't always feel good. It makes you depressed. It makes you not want to get up every day and face the world, because of not only what you deal with personally with being a person living with HIV, but also the additional traumas that come by example of criminalization or even isolation or any other type of traumas. So sex offender registry, community notifications, ad in paper and postcards to neighbors. When I was prosecuted, I had to pay fees, not necessarily $600 at that time, it was $60, but they've since raised the fees up to $600 as the way to keep people who are registered sex offenders out of the community. And I have to tell you, when you have postcards coming out in your community within a certain mile radius of where you live, to church members, to people in your schools, to people you work with, to people who work in the stores in your community, that's not a good feeling. And also when you have to put ads in the newspaper that further expands what you've experienced to hundreds and even thousands of people, that is not a good feeling. Other restrictions is freedoms to move around in parks and schools. If you're a registered sex offender, there are certain areas that you're not allowed to be in. There's many restrictions that are very, make it very difficult for people who are registered sex offenders to move around. And one thing that I'm reminded is of a person who's a mother. She's one of our survivors, she's a mother, and she's also a registered sex offender. And there are times where she cannot even take her own child to the park or even have her child live with her if she's not able to find adequate housing because of her designation as a registered sex offender. And that is crazy when a mother can't even be with her child simply because of restriction that's been placed on her based on her past. There are registries that are available online, open to the public and employers and landlords, which makes it even more challenging to when they do background checks on you, whether you're applying for a job or getting housing. I've experienced all of this. And before I knew it, I was trying to apply for an apartment. They told me that I could not get it because I was a registered sex offender. And until I was able to clear that up, then I could come back and try to reapply. And in Louisiana, where I'm from, in certain states in the United States, it is noted on your driver's license, sex offender. And I have a picture here. So can you imagine, whether it be your passport or whether it be your driver's license or any ID, going to the bank, going to the hospital, or any place where you have to show ID, and to having those words sex offender right under your photo. So just take a moment and think about how would you feel if you had to deal with that every day of your life. So as I alluded to earlier, the day-to-day life can be difficult. Employment is, for me, I really have been a saving grace by getting involved with CERO and doing this advocacy work. However, I feel that if I was to step outside of that, outside of this sort of bubble that I've been in, that I've been appreciative of and grateful to meet so many people and also to educate and inform people about the importance of HIV criminalization and what we must do about that. But many people have found it difficulty finding employment. And that continues to be an issue. And there have been some great strides to sort of ban the box so that you're not having to answer that question. But a lot of people have not really taken upon themselves to understand the burden that people who are formerly incarcerated carry as a result of getting employment. Housing. I've experienced this where I was involved with, in a relationship or getting to know someone, and this person had to move from their home after being there for nearly 10 years in order for me to come and live with them, or for us to find a place that would accept us living together. And I felt so bad because this person lived in their home for 10 years and would move as a sort of sacrifice to me because of my experience. And I just think no one should have to do that. Just no one should have to give up anything that they treasure simply because of restrictions and labels that we put on people. And again, benefits, inabilities for certain government programs, benefits, and also when you carry convictions in the United States, there's in some jurisdictions you're not able to vote. You don't, in other words, you don't have a voice in regards to the people that are supposed to be representing you in the government bodies. But I've since, when I was back in my home state, I did make it a point to get my voting rights back. But not a lot of people have the ability to do that. Thank you. So, HIV criminalization is bad public health policy because it drives stigma, discourages testing and treatment access, and is making this epidemic worse. HIV criminalization inflicts a horrific injustice on people living with HIV, while all of us now are just one disgruntled ex-partner away from a courtroom. HIV criminalization is cruel to the families and friends of those convicted as they become collateral damage, their lives often severely impacted or destroyed by the prosecution of a loved one. And I would just say, I remember when I had to surrender myself to go to prison, and I don't know how many of you can imagine having to wait 45 days to surrender yourself to go to prison. And I am someone that was very close to my grandparents, my grandmother at the time, she since has passed on. But I knew I had to do 6 months. And so my intentions were to go in and get out because I had to come back and take care of my grandmother. And I'm grateful to God that I was able to stay focused and allow myself to get through those 6 months to come back home to her and to at least be with her for a few more years before she passed. So understand that this not only affects the individual that's going through, but it also affects their family. And so I wanted to leave you with this. If you're not familiar with HIV is not a crime or HIV criminalization in any instance, please visit the zeroproject.com website, and there's plenty of information there. And please join our movement and follow us. We're doing great things there in the state, and we're also connected to the wider HIV Justice Worldwide Network. And I encourage you to support reform in all countries and all states around this issue. And one last note. The U.S. is unsafe, even for many who already live there, and especially for those most impacted. Thank you. I'm glad you all agree. So the IAS must move the conference. And so there's information here where you can please pledge your support. No AIDS 2020 in a Trump's USA. Hashtag AIDS 2020 for all. And please visit the website, AIDS2020forall.org, for lots of resources. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to share, and I hope that you've been inspired by all that's been shared today on this panel. Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage His Royal Highness, the Duke of Sussex.
Good morning, everyone. This conference has a proud history. For more than 30 years, it has been a place where science, activism, government, and medicine have come together in the fight against the HIV and AIDS epidemic. These communities have come together to rise to the big challenges the fight has required. The smashing of the deadly stigma around the virus and calling out the prejudice that has fueled it. The heart-wrenching work to prioritise treatment and research. And the work to make the world's governments play their full role in tackling the epidemic. What we have learned is we succeed when we put people at the heart of our strategies. When we focus on the reality of the children born with the virus. When we respect the young woman at risk due to the behaviour of her partner. When we try to understand the perspective of the man who lacks access to information and testing. When we harness the huge potential of people living with HIV to help guide the delivery of services and the campaign against stigma. And when we create platforms for young people to shape and direct the services that they rely on. When we do all of this, we succeed in developing approaches that make a real and lasting difference. I am honoured to be sharing the stage with someone who has always put people at the centre of his work, Sir Elton John. For over a quarter of a century, Elton has worked tirelessly to fund research and services in communities around the world. And today, he has come to Amsterdam to announce his latest endeavour, a $1 billion global partnership to break the cycle of male transmission of HIV, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We stand here at a moment when the progress we have fought so hard for is at risk from a dangerous complacency. Too many around the world are still ignoring the damaging knock-on effect on education and other community services from not prioritising HIV prevention and treatment. This is a time when new, energetic and innovative solutions are needed more than ever before. And that is exactly what you're about to see from Elton and the MenStar Coalition partners. This initiative is focused on the tough but essential work of truly changing mindsets. Inspired by the growing alarm at the rate of the new HIV infections among young women, this campaign is bravely tackling the root cause of this problem, the lack of awareness of HIV prevention amongst hard-to-reach young men. It will be guided by listening to and respecting the voices of the young men the Coalition is trying to reach. I would like to congratulate the Elton John AIDS Foundation on convening this impressive coalition with major financial backing. And I am a firm believer that we must work together across agencies, charities and industries to make change at scale. To formally announce the MenStar Coalition, it is my honour to introduce my friend, Sir Elton John.
I'd like to thank the Duke of Sussex for his very kind words, and I'd like to say good morning and what an honour it is to be here to talk to you this morning. 2 years ago, at this conference in Durban, the Duke and I addressed young people, the only age group where HIV infections are rising and not falling. We told them how vital their voices were in helping us to beat the AIDS epidemic. We promised to listen to them, to learn how we could bring them into the fight against HIV. Since then, as a community, we have been doing just that. We've been listening. We've conducted inclusive, intensive research with young people across several countries, and we have learnt much. My fellow warrior in this fight, Charlize Theron, will discuss some of these learnings in her Pass the Mic session here on this stage at 1 p.m. One overwhelming insight from this work, as the Duke of Sussex points out, is that we have to do much, much more to bring men, especially younger men, more fully into the fold. Ambassador Birx's recent data reveals that 24 to 35-year-old men continue to access HIV testing and treatment at very low, unacceptably low rates. We must find ways to change this. Too often, and for good reason, men have been seen as the problem in the fight against AIDS. So in response, we have done so much to safeguard women and girls, and rightly so. But we can't solve the whole problem if we are only addressing half the situation. If we want to win this fight, if we want to end AIDS once and for all, we must make men part of the solution. It is time there was a global coalition to teach men to protect themselves. And in doing so, it will teach them to better protect not only their wives and girlfriends, their sisters and daughters, but also critically their brothers and their sons. That coalition launches today, and it's called MenStar. I'm proud to show you more about it.
AIDS is still the biggest killer of women of reproductive age worldwide. It's vital that we come together in partnership to address this.
At PEPFAR, we've been increasing our investment in prevention of infections of young women and young men. Particularly with young women, we've been doing this through our DREAMS initiative, which is focused on preventing infections in adolescents and young girls between the ages of 15 and 24. At the same time, in these communities, we've been finding that the young men between 25 and 35 are unaware of their HIV diagnosis and are unknowingly transmitting HIV to these young women.
Funding services for women and girls, no matter how good they are, only gets you so far in driving down transmission.
Men, they are actually contributing to this HIV spread because they're the ones normally who walks out of the relationship.
Reaching out to men and boys can be quite challenging because they're a part of the population that doesn't always access health services, listen to public health messages.
Pia na mtazamo kwa sababu kwa vile wamesifiwa sana, inawezekana sasa zile sifa zimewazidi kiasi kwamba wanajiamini. Na hapa kwetu, hata hapa mali tulipokaa hapa sokoni, kuna mtu kama hajaenda hospitali kwa muda wa mwaka, anajiona kama amevuka malengo. Kwamba yeye kwamba haisemi bwana mama ndogo ndogo na kuna 40 tu kwamba anapona.
We need to find new and different ways of addressing them.
The reason why it's really important working with men is that too many of them don't get tested.
Kute abao ngiri kumalonga na mimi. Ndingeti chichika gozi batingetaka kufura na kwandiriga. Otherwise tuswira tuma bawa tapedza basa tuswira timadulu titangana na mainini movie.
Nahisi kwamba nitakataliwa na watu ambao nitawapata. Mtu akijua mimi ni mwathirika, nitakosa mpenzi ama mtu wa kuongea katika mahusiano.
I believe this will not stop until men step up to know their status, to protect themselves and to protect their partners.
We wanted to pool our capabilities so that we could really deliver testing and treatment services to men in an integrated way. And that's how MenStar came about.
Working with men is absolutely critical if we're going to end the HIV epidemic by 2030. Men are less likely to know their status, practice consistent prevention, or access treatment.
HIV self-testing will play a very important role in the MenStar campaign. Not only to give information, but also make them aware about prevention, treatment, and care services.
As well as addressing HIV amongst men, it will help men protect their female partners too.
We are proud.
We are proud. We are proud to be part of the MenStar
Coalition.
I'm delighted that the UK's key HIV partners are playing a pivotal role in the MenStar Coalition.
As you can see, MenStar offers a broad range of resources, research, community activism, consumer products, healthcare in the public sector. As a whole, this will provide the best platform for finding and reaching men with HIV prevention, testing and treatment. I'm very proud of the partners we brought together to launch this coalition. It demonstrates a real commitment to real action that will make a real difference in the lives of the men who need it most. To tell you more about how we plan to do that, I'd like to ask one of Africa's finest sons, Ndaba Mandela, to come to the stage.
Molweni, sanibonani, botarde, goeiedag, good morning. As an African man who has seen far too many people succumb to this epidemic, including my own parents, it is time we make an end to this epidemic. It is time we come together, ladies and gentlemen, and put an end to this and achieve our goals. I am very proud and excited to be here today to be part of this MenStar Coalition launch today. This coalition will allow men to finally fully participate in creating an HIV-free generation of the future. Knowing your status is a critical part of this process. Next year, MenStar will launch a large-scale campaign that is all about self-testing young men across the continent of Africa, called Chukua Selfie.
And a third of the people living with HIV don't know their status. That is way too high as a percentage. HIV testing is critical for overcoming that barrier.
Test yourself on site. HIV self-testing. Ozani, come test yourself on site.
Millions don't want to get tested in a facility. Millions are prevented from doing so because they can't take the time off work. And millions more worry about who might see them or find out about their status.
At PEPFAR, we're determined to reach populations that have been often missed with HIV services, particularly including young men. We can only achieve control of this epidemic if we find all genders, all ages, and all risk groups.
We believe the Chukua Selfie campaign can make a big difference, especially for testing men in HIV.
Our user insights in Kenya found that young men see HIV self-testing as particularly appealing. They would change their testing habits if kits were available at local outlets and at affordable prices.
You're going to take your testing pad, you swab your upper gums, and then your lower gums.
We are making self-test kits more affordable, supporting service delivery channels that are cheaper and attractive, and co-creating directly with men to speak to their motivations and aspirations to trigger behavior change.
It is quite an easy thing to do. What I like about it is the fact that one does it in his own space, total privacy. So you get to know your own results by yourself.
We think the Chukua Selfie campaign will speak to young men and trigger them to get checked.
We have to ensure that young men have access to health care, to HIV diagnosis, and the most important treatment so that they can thrive.
By unlocking the power of self-testing, we can make testing convenient, confidential, and easy to fit into your life.
You can learn more about the MenStar Coalition in the Global Village at booth 527. But now, I would like to take this opportunity to call all the partners to join us on stage. PEPFAR, Global Fund, Unit Aid, Children's Investment Fund Foundation, Gilead, Johnson & Johnson, and last but not least, the Elton John AIDS Foundation. Please join us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to now call up on the young activists that have been taking action to help us officially launch this great initiative. Young people, young activists, where are you? Yes. Give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.